In year 2008, the Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, publicly apologized to the Indigenous community and the former students of Indian Residential School on behalf of the Government of Canada. Although this act signifies Canada's initiative of recovering the Indigenous cultures, the horrible impact left by the residential school system on Aboriginal language cannot be overlooked. According to UNESCO Atlas of World Language in Danger, among 87 Indigenous languages that are still existing or used to exist in Canada, 22 are in vulnerable states, 6 being endangered, 24 being severely endangered, 32 being critically endangered, and 3 already extincted. The statistics from the United Nations is evident proof that there's a notable decrease in Aboriginal languages over years, mainly due to residential school. Blockading Indigenous children from accessing their native cultures and the transgenerational ripple effect caused by residential school, combined with lack of federal government involvement, leading to an awful situation of Indigenous language that are being faced now. The very purpose of residential school is to assimilate Aboriginals who are condemned as ignorant, savage, and like children in need of guidance. Therefore, it is expected that some form of damage will be inflicted on Indigenous culture, namely the languages. In total, 2 methods will usually apply while attempting to restrict Indigenous children from speaking in their native tongues: submerging them in an environment of foreign language and relentlessly punishing them if the Indigenous language were found to be practiced. According to an early age residential school survivor, Shirley Williams, an Ojibwe elder in the Department of Native Study at Trent University, who attended St. Joseph's Residential School in Spanish, Ontario, at the age of 10. During her very first arrival, when she was only capable of speaking her native language, a nun greeted him and allegedly started instructing him in English, as Shirley recalls. I could only imagine what she was trying to say because this is what my sister told me, what she would probably say, so I had in my mind what she was trying to tell us. The story of Shirley Williams is a piece of compelling evidence that one of the fundamental policies of residential school is to overwhelm the Indigenous children with these Western languages to effectively disconnect them from their native tongues. As the result of such action is inevitably destructive to the Aboriginal languages due to the domains of use of these individual languages are considerably reduced, if not simply absent, which is leading cause of forgetting a language. In addition to being flooded by a complete English/French environment, the students were also strictly forbidden to speak their languages. According to a webpage titled Language Lost, Stolen Lives, the Indigenous People of Canada and the Indian Residential Schools on Facing History and Ourselves, a website dedicated on promoting the information about residential school, punishments including forced isolation, withholding of meals, and washing child's mouth with soap, were expected to act upon children who were found speaking their native languages. In some extreme cases, teachers of the residential school purportedly gave children electrical shocks or pushed needles into their tongues to associate the speaking of their mother tongue with excruciating pain. Due to the fear for traumatizing castigation of predominant foreign languages, the likelihood for Indigenous children to practice their language is virtually impossible. Thus, it is reasonable to conclude that the diversity of Aboriginal languages is significantly impaired through the residential school detaching the descendants of the Indigenous communities from their own cultures. The effect of inhumane treatment which Indigenous children receive while they are in the residential school is proven to be still lingering around. The legacy of residential school continues undermining the diversity of Indigenous languages. In a panel discussion on Gord Downie's Secret Path, an autobiographic novel focusing on the tragic incident of Channing Winjack, a native boy who ran away from the residential school yet passed away on his search for home, Tasha Hubbard, a survivor of a residential school, provided an audience with an interesting yet thought-provoking conversation between her and her son. Tasha recalled that her son was asking her to teach him their language, but Tasha awkwardly replied, "I can't." The answer of Tasha is an evident proof that the impact of residential school on the Indigenous languages is intergenerational. The effect of losing language is rippling outward from those affected by residential school to a younger generation. In most cases, when there is an extinction of language occurs, the language itself dies out gradually as successive generations of speakers become bilingual and then begin to lose proficiency in their traditional languages. As was suggested by an article published on Global News, the number of indigenous speakers has continuously exhibited a downward trend since 1950s. The indigenous languages are on its path leading to extermination, and the legacy of residential school is the driving force behind it. Last but not least, the lack of governmental assistance in recovering indigenous culture is another leading cause of language loss within indigenous communities. Before 2008, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was implemented, national spending on supporting indigenous groups is minuscule when compared with the program that were later established. Take the year 2005 as an example. In 2005, a $5 billion 10-year agreement, which is supposed to be a program dedicated on improving the condition within the First Nation reserves and rehabilitating the devastating indigenous culture, was signed by Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin. However, it was never fully implemented after the Conservative took the office in 2006. In addition to poorly enacted programs, the national budget allocated to Canada Heritage, the heart of Canada's social, official languages, multicultural reconciliation, and economic sectors, were merely $400,000, significantly lower than the funding distributed to the Aboriginal tobacco control, which the numerical figure was situated at $1.5 million. There was no noticeable increase in governmental funding regarding with the reconciliation of the indigenous communities until 2010. As the result of such long-term negligence, the lasting effect of residential school had enough time to progressively encroach on the Aboriginal cultures, deteriorating the issue of indigenous language loss, and ultimately making it especially challenging for nowadays social workers to recover them fully. In the Gordani song Secret Path, there's a quote that stands out from the rest. The lyrics of the quote goes, "It's a windbreaker, not a jean jacket." In the story, it signifies Channy's internal fight against the residential school system by rejecting the knowledge he was instructed or general assimilation he was forced to receive. However, in reality, it is a proven fact that the system residential school has significantly undermined the diversity of indigenous languages within Canada by disassociating indigenous children from their native culture, causing a transgenerational negative impact. With the constant disregard of the federal government, millions of individuals with the indigenous identity feels detached from their own cultures in modern society. Although the TRC has improved the situation in the past decade, the problem of language loss has not been completely solved. Further action should be taken, otherwise Canada will be deprived of an essential constituent of its very origin.